Natalie Parker had grown up in the foster care system of Arizona, a child whose life began with abandonment. She never knew her parents. From the moment she was born, her mother signed the papers at the hospital, leaving her behind with nothing but a name. Nurses whispered that the woman was far too young, too unprepared for responsibility, and simply walked away. For Natalie, that decision would shape every moment of her childhood. She remembered birthdays in foster homes, candles glowing on cakes baked by caretakers, other children singing, and yet her wish was always the same. Every year, when she closed her eyes and blew out the candles, she prayed her mother would come back. She imagined a knock at the door, a woman appearing with open arms, explaining that it had all been a mistake, that she had been forced to leave her baby behind, but now she was ready to take her home. That fantasy lived with Natalie through every birthday, every Christmas, every long night when the other children fell asleep and she stared at the ceiling in silence. But reality came harsh and sudden. One day, when Natalie was around 12, a foster mother told her bluntly what others had avoided saying. "Sweetheart, she left because she wanted to. She was young, she had other plans, and she didn't want a baby to hold her back. You need to understand, nobody is coming for you. You'll have to make it on your own." The words cut like glass. Natalie stopped asking questions about her family, but inside, she carried the wound of rejection that never fully healed. In the foster homes, she found one source of comfort, a girl her age named Vanessa Cooper. Vanessa had been abandoned too, but her story was different. She had been born with a congenital heart defect and spent her first months in the NICU before being placed in the system. Doctors said she might not survive, and when she did, her parents still walked away. They left nothing but a delicate necklace clasped around her infant neck, a gold pendant shaped like a rosebud, clearly handmade and valuable. Social workers assumed it was a family heirloom, perhaps the only link to Vanessa's biological roots. Vanessa hated the necklace. To her, it symbolized rejection, the proof that her parents could afford something beautiful, yet still refused to love her. But Natalie thought it was extraordinary. Sometimes on birthdays or holidays, Vanessa would wear it, and Natalie's eyes would shine with admiration. "It's beautiful," Natalie whispered more than once. Vanessa would shrug, almost bitterly. "It's a curse. I'd throw it away if I could." Yet she never did. The pendant was both wound and thread, tying her to a past she despised but could never escape. The two girls clung to each other through the years. At school, when classmates sneered at the foster kids, they defended one another. At night, they whispered about the families they might one day have. Loving parents, warm kitchens, bedrooms decorated with posters and lamps instead of the institutional walls of a group home. They made promises to stay friends forever, no matter what happened when they aged out of the system. Natalie grew into a serious, determined girl. The pain of abandonment became fuel for her ambition. She studied harder than anyone else, determined to prove that she could succeed without parents cheering her on from the sidelines. Teachers noticed her sharp mind, her kindness toward younger children, and encouraged her to pursue teaching. Natalie wanted that life. She wanted to give children the patience and encouragement she herself had longed for. Vanessa's path was more fragile. Her health kept her from sports and left her tired easily. She was self-conscious about the way she sometimes limped after running or how quickly she grew pale. Natalie always encouraged her, telling her she was stronger than she realized. But Vanessa carried bitterness inside. While Natalie accepted the past with quiet sorrow, Vanessa burned with resentment. "They threw me away like I was defective," she once said, her eyes flashing. "I hate them. I don't care who they are. They're dead to me." Natalie couldn't argue. She just listened because that was what friends did. Still, she hoped one day Vanessa would find peace. She herself had reached a fragile acceptance. Her mother was gone, and nothing would change that. The best she could do was build a different kind of family someday, one that was chosen rather than inherited. Years later, Both girls would leave the foster system and begin adult lives on separate paths. But in those tender, formative years, when the sting of abandonment was fresh and hope flickered, like a candle against the dark, Natalie and Vanessa leaned on each other. They were not sisters by blood, but by survival. Each girl was a mirror of the other's pain. Two children marked by loss, yet dreaming of the same impossible thing, a family that would never leave. For Natalie, those dreams would shape the choices she made, guiding her toward love, loyalty, and the quiet strength that would one day be tested in ways she could never imagine. As Natalie Parker entered adulthood, the foster care system released her into the world with little more than a folder of documents and a state stipend to cover basic needs. Yet her determination carried her further than most expected. Teachers who had once seen her potential helped her secure scholarships and grants. She enrolled in a local college, majoring in education, with her heart set on becoming an elementary school teacher. For Natalie, it wasn't just about a career, it was a calling. She wanted to be the adult she herself had needed when she was a child, patient, encouraging, a steady presence for kids who might otherwise feel unseen. College was not easy. She worked part-time jobs, waiting tables, tutoring, even stocking shelves at night to pay for rent and groceries. But with every exhausting day, she kept her eyes on the finish line. For years later, she walked across the graduation stage in a borrowed cap and gown. For the first time in her life, as the crowd cheered for their sons and daughters, she didn't feel like an outsider. She had built something with her own hands, and that diploma was proof she could stand on her own. Vanessa's path looked very different. When she aged out of foster care, she was also granted a small apartment through a housing program for former foster youth. The place was barely more than a one-bedroom studio, drafty in the winter and stifling in the summer, but it was hers. She took pride in keeping it clean, even as she juggled grueling shifts at a manufacturing plant. Her health was fragile, the old heart condition often flaring under stress, but she refused to let it stop her. Co-workers noticed how she never complained, even when her hands trembled from exhaustion. Vanessa was resilient, but the sparkle in her laughter from childhood had dulled. She and Natalie stayed in touch, but the distance between their apartments and the weight of their separate lives meant visits grew rare. Phone calls replaced whispered secrets in the dark, and text messages became the thin thread tying them together. It was during this time that Natalie's life took an unexpected turn. One sunny afternoon, walking home from the library with a stack of books, she noticed a young man watching her with a sheepish smile. His name was Christopher Parker, a recent engineering graduate who had lost a bet with friends. As part of the game, he had to approach the first woman who crossed his path and ask for her number. Natalie laughed when he admitted it, amused by his honesty. She could have ignored him, but there was something genuine in his eyes, warmth, humor, a kind of earnestness she rarely encountered. What began as a dare turned into coffee dates, long walks under the Arizona sun, and late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. Christopher wasn't flashy. He didn't make grand promises or use empty words. He simply showed up, picking her up after work, asking about her day, listening when she spoke. For a girl who had grown up never trusting permanence, his steadiness was a balm she didn't know she needed. Within 2 years, Christopher proposed. He did it quietly, not in front of a crowd or with elaborate theatrics, but on a quiet evening in her tiny apartment, where the smell of takeout filled the air and textbooks were scattered across the couch. He pulled out a small velvet box, his hands trembling just enough to betray his nerves. "Natalie, you're my best friend. My home. Will you marry me?" Her yes came with tears not just of love, but of disbelief that someone truly wanted her for life. Still, beneath the joy, fear crept in. She dreaded meeting his parents. Natalie had always carried the stigma of being the foster kid. She worried Deborah and William Parker, an older couple with established roots, might see her as unworthy of their only son. The day finally came when Christopher introduced her to them. Natalie's hands shook as she stepped into their home, a modest but cozy house on the edge of Phoenix, surrounded by desert plants and a carefully tended garden. She expected polite smiles, maybe guarded questions. Instead, she was enveloped in warmth. Deborah Parker, with her silver hair pulled back neatly, clasped Natalie's hands and said, "We've heard so much about you. Welcome, sweetheart." William, tall and broad-shouldered, added with a grin, "Our boy's lucky. You're exactly what he needs." They didn't treat her like an outsider. They didn't ask about her past with suspicion. They welcomed her with casseroles, hugs, and stories about Christopher's childhood. Natalie, who had braced herself for rejection, found something she had never known before: parents who looked at her with unconditional kindness. Over dinner, Deborah insisted on serving her the choicest cuts, while William asked about her teaching job, nodding with pride when she spoke of her students. For the first time, she felt like she belonged at a family table not as a guest, but as a daughter. It was a turning point. Natalie had finally found the family she had dreamed of since she was a little girl blowing out candles in a foster home. She had Christopher, a man who loved her without condition, and she had in-laws who treated her as though she had always been theirs. The emptiness of her childhood began to feel less like a curse and more like the path that had led her here. Yet in the shadow of her happiness lay the quiet contrast of Vanessa's life. While Natalie stepped into warmth and stability, Vanessa was still working late nights, still coughing from exhaustion, still clutching the rose pendant she despised yet couldn't discard. Their destinies, once so entwined, now stretched in opposite directions. And though they didn't say it out loud, both young women felt the distance, not just in miles, but in fate. Natalie and Christopher's wedding was a modest affair, held in a small church on the outskirts of Phoenix. She wore a borrowed white dress that fit her like a dream, and Christopher, in his simple navy suit, couldn't stop smiling as he slipped the ring onto her finger. There were no grand chandeliers, no luxury cars lined up outside. Only close friends, a few co-workers, and Deborah and William Parker beaming with pride. For Natalie, it wasn't about extravagance. It was about finally having a home, a husband, and in-laws who treated her as if she had always been their own. Married life unfolded gently for her. She started teaching second grade at an elementary school, pouring her heart into her students. Christopher's engineering career was steady. He often traveled for projects, but always came home to her with stories and laughter. Their evenings together were simple but filled with warmth. Dinners at the kitchen table, long walks through desert trails, and quiet weekends tending Deborah's garden. Natalie carried the joy of belonging like a fragile flame, guarding it carefully against the winds of doubt that sometimes reminded her of her past. But while Natalie thrived, Vanessa's life spiraled into hardship. She had met a man through mutual friends, someone who promised love and protection. At first, he seemed charming, attentive, even protective. For a while, she believed she had found her own chance at happiness. But the mask slipped quickly. He became controlling, jealous, and eventually violent. The bruises on her arms and the fear in her eyes told a story she never wanted to speak aloud. When she discovered she was pregnant, he walked out without hesitation, leaving her alone in a dingy apartment with little more than unpaid bills and a future clouded by uncertainty. Vanessa sold her state-provided apartment, hoping to find something safer and closer to work. Instead, she ended up in a cramped rental on the poorer side of town, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the neighbors argued late into the night. The money from selling her apartment vanished quickly. Medical bills, rent deposits, and the basic expenses of preparing for a child drained it away. Soon, she was living paycheck to paycheck, her swollen belly making factory shifts unbearable. There were nights she went to bed hungry just to make sure she could save enough for baby clothes and formula. The baby, a little girl she named Harper, arrived on a cold winter night. Despite the pain and fear, Vanessa held her daughter with trembling arms and whispered, "You're my everything now." Harper became her reason to endure, the only light in an otherwise dark chapter. But the challenges of single motherhood weighed heavily on her frail health. Her congenital heart condition left her weak, and more than once she fainted at work or found herself unable to climb the stairs to her apartment without resting halfway. Natalie, though busy with her own new life, never forgot her friend. When she learned of Vanessa's struggles, she visited often, bringing groceries, diapers, and warm meals. Christopher helped where he could, fixing leaky pipes in Vanessa's apartment and watching Harper so Vanessa could rest. Deborah and William, upon hearing about the situation, quietly stepped in as well. Deborah knitted blankets for Harper, her careful stitches filled with tenderness, while William, pragmatic as ever, wired money to Vanessa's account. He told her, "Don't argue. You need it more than we do." Vanessa's pride ached at taking their help, but she was too exhausted to refuse. She accepted with quiet gratitude, knowing it was the only reason she and Harper stayed afloat. Still, she couldn't ignore the ache in her chest when she compared her life to Natalie's. The contrast was stark. Natalie came home to Christopher's embrace, to a stable job, to in-laws who celebrated her as a daughter. Vanessa came home to unpaid bills, to loneliness, to the constant fear of what her failing health might mean for Harper's future. Both young women had grown up in the same foster homes, dreaming of families and safety. Yet their paths had split so drastically that it seemed almost cruel. Natalie often wrestled with guilt. At night, lying beside Christopher, she would think of Vanessa alone in her small apartment and wonder why fate had given her one kind of life and her friend another. She couldn't change Vanessa's past, but she vowed to never let her feel abandoned again. If there was one thing Natalie understood deeply, it was the pain of being left behind, and she refused to let Vanessa face it alone. Two girls, bound by childhood scars, had stepped into adulthood carrying the same wounds. Yet where Natalie's life blossomed with stability and love, Vanessa's was marked by hardship and betrayal. Their lives, once parallel, now diverged into two stories, one of fragile fulfillment, the other of relentless struggle. And though neither knew it yet, the invisible thread between them was far from cut. It was tightening, drawing them toward a truth that would one day upend everything. Life in the Parker family seemed almost idyllic, the kind of quiet stability Natalie Parker had once believed existed only in storybooks. Christopher's engineering projects often sent him across the state or even out of Arizona, leaving Natalie alone for days at a time. But she was never truly alone. Deborah and William Parker filled the space, welcoming her into their suburban home as if it had always belonged to her. Their house sat at the edge of Phoenix, where the sprawl of the city gave way to stretches of desert and open sky. It wasn't extravagant, but it was well-loved, a single-story ranch-style home with a wide front porch, a vegetable garden out back, and wind chimes that sang softly whenever the breeze rolled off the desert. Natalie loved everything about it. She loved how Deborah planted marigolds along the walkway every spring, insisting the flowers kept pests away. She loved how William kept a shed full of fishing gear, his pride and joy after years of hard labor. She loved the way the house smelled of cinnamon in the winter, lemon polish in the summer, and always of Deborah's cooking. When Christopher was away, Natalie often drove out after work, parking her car in the gravel driveway and hearing Deborah's voice call out, "Sweetheart, come in. I just made coffee." The older woman had a way of fussing over her that Natalie secretly cherished, offering second helpings at dinner, wrapping shawls around her shoulders if she looked cold, pressing leftovers into her hands to take home. William was quieter, but no less affectionate. He'd invite her to sit on the porch in the evenings, sipping iced tea while the desert sun dipped behind the mountains. Sometimes he'd show her the fish he caught on weekend trips, though he rarely boasted. His happiness came from simple things: a good catch, a well-kept lawn, a family gathered around the table. For Natalie, who had grown up with nothing but government-issued bedding and plastic cafeteria trays, it was a kind of magic. She marveled at how natural it felt. She wasn't just tolerated, she was embraced. Deborah would call her on a whim, asking for help with a recipe or advice about the school supply drive at church. William teased her gently, calling her our favorite teacher whenever he introduced her to friends. In moments like these, Natalie sometimes caught herself wondering if this was what it might have been like to have real parents. She never spoke it aloud, but in her heart, Deborah and William filled the aching void her own parents had left behind. The house itself seemed to mirror the sense of belonging. Natalie loved wandering through the garden with Deborah, pulling weeds while listening to stories of the past. Deborah would laugh as she recounted how Christopher once tried to build a treehouse and nearly broke his arm. Inside, photographs lined the mantel, Christopher as a child, family vacations, holidays long past. Deborah began adding new pictures with Natalie in them. Thanksgiving dinners, birthdays, Christmas mornings. For the first time in her life, Natalie saw herself framed on a family wall, no longer the outsider peering in. On weekends, she often lingered long after dinner, sitting with Deborah and William by the fireplace. They would talk about everything and nothing: the weather, politics, William's fishing trips, Deborah's endless gardening projects. Sometimes Natalie would read aloud from a book while Deborah knitted and William nodded off in his chair. The simplicity of it struck her as extraordinary. She had grown up surrounded by other children's noise and chaos, always yearning for a corner of peace. Here, peace was everywhere. It wasn't lost on her how sharply her life contrasted with Vanessa's. When she visited her old friend's apartment, the air was heavy with fatigue. Vanessa juggled baby bottles, piles of laundry, and the endless demands of a toddler, all in a space barely big enough for two. The walls were scuffed, the refrigerator often half empty, and Vanessa's face carried lines of exhaustion far beyond her age. Natalie wanted to bring her into the Parker home, let her sit at Deborah's table, let William tease her into smiling. But Vanessa was proud, too proud to fully accept the life Raft Natalie kept offering. She would accept groceries, a little money, a kind word, but never pity. And so, Natalie's world seemed divided between two realities: the gentle rhythm of the Parker home and the harsh struggle of Vanessa's apartment. In one, laughter, warmth, and unconditional care wrapped around her like a blanket. In the other, the air was tense with survival, where every dollar and every breath carried weight. Still, every time Natalie walked through Deborah's garden gate, she felt a deep, unshakable gratitude. The Parker home was everything she had once dreamed of during lonely nights in foster care. It was the family she had wished for on birthdays, the parents she had longed for during holidays, the anchor she had needed in a world that had once felt indifferent to her existence. What Natalie could not know, as she basked in the glow of this newfound family, was that even the most perfect-seeming homes can harbor shadows. Behind Deborah's gentle eyes and William's steady kindness lay secrets buried deep in the past, secrets waiting for the right moment to surface. For now, though, the Parker household remained her safe haven, her dream made real, the place where she finally believed happiness could last. One late afternoon, Natalie stopped by the Parker house after work. The air was warm, the scent of desert sage drifting through the garden where Deborah knelt among her flowers. Natalie carried a tote bag stuffed with books, graded papers, and a few small items she had promised to drop off for Deborah. As she stepped through the doorway, the strap slipped from her shoulder, and the contents spilled onto the hardwood floor. Notebooks scattered, pens rolled across the rug, and at the very center lay a small velvet pouch. The string had come loose, and from it slid a delicate gold necklace with a rose-shaped pendant. It caught the fading sunlight, glinting with quiet beauty. Deborah's eyes fell on it, and in that instant her expression froze. She went pale, her hands trembling as she reached for the back of a chair. Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice raw in a way Natalie had never heard before. Natalie bent quickly, scooping the pendant back into the pouch. "Oh, this isn't mine. It belongs to my friend, Vanessa. She asked me to hold on to it for her." She's had it since she was a baby. She smiled faintly, brushing it off as nothing important. But Deborah didn't smile. She nodded stiffly, murmuring something about needing to check the oven, and walked away before Natalie could question her. For the rest of the evening, Deborah seemed distracted, her hands unsteady as she served dinner. William noticed, asking once if she was feeling well, but she waved him off. Natalie felt a flicker of unease, but told herself it was nothing. After all, it was just a necklace. The next day, however, unease turned into something sharper. Natalie returned to the Parker house unannounced, hoping to bring Deborah some flowers as a small surprise. She stepped inside, quietly, the door left unlocked as it often was. From the hallway, she heard voices drifting from the kitchen. Deborah and William speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Natalie froze, instinct telling her not to interrupt. She stayed in the shadows, listening. "I'm telling you, Will, I saw it with my own eyes," Deborah's voice cracked, filled with something between fear and sorrow. "That pendant, the rose, it was hers. It has to be." William's tone was low, steady but grim. "Deborah, it's been more than 25 years. You can't know for certain. Maybe it's just a coincidence." "No," Deborah insisted. "You know what I did that night. You know what I gave her. I couldn't save them both. We took the boy, and I left the girl with nothing but that pendant. And now it's here in Natalie's hands. Do you understand what that means?" Natalie's heart pounded. She pressed her back against the wall, breath shallow. She wanted to move, to stop listening, but her body wouldn't obey. The words were like shards cutting into her chest. William exhaled heavily. "If what you think is true, then God help us all. Christopher and Natalie, brother and sister," Deborah whispered, the words trembling with horror. "We've let them build a marriage on a lie. We've committed a sin that cannot be undone." The silence that followed was suffocating. Natalie clutched the strap of her bag, her pulse roaring in her ears. Brother and sister? It couldn't be true. It couldn't. Her mind scrambled through memories, searching for anything, any sign that might prove or disprove what she had just heard. But all she could think of was Christopher's smile, their vows, the home they had built together. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her. She steadied herself against the wall, willing her breath to quiet, terrified they would hear her. Deborah's voice broke the silence again, softer this time, laden with guilt. "I thought I was saving a child. I never imagined this day would come. What have we done?" William's reply was little more than a growl. "We'll say nothing until we know for sure. No good can come from rushing to judgment. But Deborah, if it's true, if she is the one, then everything we've built will collapse." Natalie stumbled back, quietly, slipping out the front door before they could discover her. Outside, the desert sky was a blaze of orange and purple, but she saw none of it. Her world tilted, every certainty unraveling at once. The drive home blurred past her in fragments, the hum of the engine, the burn of tears in her eyes, the weight of those words echoing endlessly. Brother and sister. At home, Christopher greeted her cheerfully, kissing her cheek, asking about her day. She smiled faintly, nodding, but her chest tightened with every glance at him. She wanted to scream the truth she had overheard, to demand answers, yet fear sealed her lips. What if it was true? What if everything they had built was founded on something unthinkable? That night, Natalie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The image of the necklace haunted her, the delicate rose pendant glimmering in Deborah's shocked eyes. It was no longer just a keepsake of Vanessa's. It was a key, a symbol of secrets buried long ago. And now those secrets threatened to shatter the family she had finally found. For the first time since marrying into the Parkers, Natalie felt the fragile walls of her dream life begin to crack. The perfect home, the loving in-laws, the safety she had clung to, they all trembled on the edge of collapse, their foundations shaken by a truth too dark to face. Natalie could not carry the weight of suspicion any longer. 2 days after overhearing Deborah and William's conversation, she returned to their house, her heart pounding so violently she felt it might give her away. Deborah welcomed her with her usual warm smile, but Natalie saw the flicker of unease in her eyes, as though the older woman sensed what was coming. When the three of them settled in the living room, Natalie clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Her voice was steady, though every nerve inside her shook. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said, looking from Deborah to William. "About the necklace. About what you were talking about the other night." Silence blanketed the room. Deborah's knitting needles fell into her lap, forgotten. William's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the floor. For a moment, Natalie thought they would deny everything, but then Deborah's shoulders sagged under the weight of decades. "You heard us," Deborah murmured, her voice low and trembling. "I should have known. I should have told you long ago." William's eyes closed briefly, as if bracing himself against a blow. "Deborah," he warned softly, but she shook her head. "No more secrets," she said firmly, though tears brimmed in her eyes. She reached for Natalie's hand. "Sweetheart, I need you to understand how it happened. Why it happened." Natalie nodded, though fear churned in her stomach. Deborah drew a shaky breath. "It was nearly 30 years ago. I was working as a nurse in the maternity ward. A girl came in, so young she barely looked old enough to drive. She was alone. No family, no father of the babies. She gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl." Deborah's voice cracked on the word twins. Natalie's breath hitched. The boy was strong, healthy. But the girl! Deborah's hands twisted in her lap. She was so fragile. She had a congenital heart defect. The doctors weren't sure she would survive more than a few days. That young mother didn't want either child. She signed the papers almost immediately, terminating her rights. She walked out of the hospital without a glance back. William's deep voice broke in, heavy with bitterness. "We couldn't have children of our own. We had tried for years." Deborah came home that night shaking, crying, saying she had held 2 babies. One left to die, one left abandoned. "We made a choice." Deborah's tears spilled freely now. "We adopted the boy. We brought him home. That boy was Christopher. He became our whole world." Natalie's head spun. She felt the room tilt, the furniture blurring at the edges. Christopher, her husband, was the boy in the story. "What about the girl?" she whispered. Deborah pressed a hand to her mouth. "They told us she wouldn't live long, that it was better not to get attached. She was placed into the foster system, but before they took her, I couldn't stand it. I knew she would grow up with nothing. So I gave her something, just one thing to prove she had been loved, even for a moment." Her voice broke completely. "That rose pendant, it had belonged to my mother. I slipped it around the baby's neck before the social worker carried her away." The image seared itself into Natalie's mind. A frail infant, swaddled and silent, wearing the same necklace she had seen spill from her bag just days ago. Deborah's sobs filled the room. "I thought she would die. I told myself it was mercy. But she lived, didn't she? She grew up. And now that pendant has come back into this house." William leaned forward, his face grave, his hands clasped tightly as though in prayer. "We have carried this shame for decades, Natalie. We told ourselves we did the right thing, that we could not save them both. But not a day has passed that Deborah hasn't thought of that little girl. We should have fought for her. We should have taken both." His voice cracked with guilt. "Instead, we convinced ourselves that one child was better than none, and we lived with that lie." Natalie sat in stunned silence, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Her Christopher was adopted, and somewhere out there, the baby girl his parents had left behind had survived. That girl might have grown up in the same system she herself had endured. Deborah clutched Natalie's hands again, her tears falling hot against her skin. "Please forgive us. We thought we were doing the merciful thing. We never imagined that necklace would come back to haunt us. We never imagined the two children might ever cross paths again. The words echoed in Natalie's chest like a thunderclap. Two children. Twins. Brother and sister. She stared at Deborah, at William, at the walls of the home that had once felt like her sanctuary and now seemed filled with shadows. The family she had cherished. The love she had trusted. Suddenly, it all trembled on the edge of ruin. The confession left the room heavy with silence. Deborah's hands still trembled, her face pale as she clutched the armrest of her chair. William stared into the fire as though searching for absolution in the flames. But Natalie could barely breathe. Their words, twins abandoned, rose pendant, swirled inside her head until she thought she might collapse under their weight. Deborah's eyes found hers, wide and stricken. "Natalie," she whispered, "don't you see? You must be the girl. The necklace, it came from you. You and Christopher are the twins." The words struck like a physical blow. Natalie's stomach twisted violently. She wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but Deborah's certainty left no room for escape. The idea was unbearable. Her marriage, the love she had built, the family she had finally found, all of it would be destroyed if this were true. William finally turned, his expression grim. "We can't jump to conclusions, Deborah. We have no proof beyond that necklace. But if she is right," he stopped, unable to finish. Natalie felt her pulse roar in her ears. Christopher knew nothing of this. He had lived his whole life believing Deborah and William were his real parents. To tell him he was adopted would be earth-shattering. To tell him he might have married his own sister, unthinkable. "I need air," Natalie whispered, rising unsteadily to her feet. But Deborah grabbed her hand, desperate. "Please, Natalie, you have to understand. We thought the girl was lost. We never dreamed she would survive, let alone end up here. How else could you have that necklace?" Natalie froze. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her mind racing. The truth pressed against her lips like a secret trying to escape. Finally, she forced the words out. "It's not mine," she said softly. "That necklace, it doesn't belong to me." Deborah blinked, confusion etched across her face. "What are you talking about?" "It belongs to Vanessa," Natalie said, her voice trembling but firm. "My closest friend from foster care. She's had it since she was a baby. She told me it was the only thing left to her from her parents. She hated it, but she never let it go." The room shifted. Deborah's breath caught, her lips parting in shock. William sat forward, his brow furrowing. "Vanessa, your friend." Natalie nodded. "Yes, we grew up together. She was sickly as a child in and out of hospitals. She always said her heart was weak. Doctors told her she might not live long, but she did. She carried that pendant her entire life, a gold rose, the same one you described." Deborah's hand flew to her mouth as tears welled again. "Dear God," she whispered. "Then she must be the girl, not you. She's the twin." Natalie's chest rose and fell rapidly. Relief and dread collided inside her. Relief, because perhaps she and Christopher were not bound by blood. Dread, because if Vanessa was truly the twin, then the truth would destroy her friend's life. William's voice was hoarse. "This changes everything. Christopher's sister. All these years she's been out there alone." Deborah began to sob, rocking slightly in her chair. "And I let her go. I left her to suffer, while I raised her brother in comfort. How could I have done that? How could I have turned my back on her?" Natalie felt a wave of grief for Vanessa. The pieces fit too perfectly. Her illness, the necklace, her sense of rejection, so deep it consumed her. She wasn't just another foster child. She was Christopher's sister, the very child Deborah had abandoned to the system with nothing but a fragile heirloom. The weight of it pressed down on Natalie until she thought her heart might split. She saw Vanessa's tired smile, her thin frame bent over baby Harper, the exhaustion that had never lifted. She remembered all the times Vanessa had said she felt cursed, unwanted, broken. And all along, she had been the daughter of people who might have saved her, but chose not to. Natalie's voice trembled as she spoke. She has a daughter now. Harper. They're barely getting by. She thinks her whole life has been nothing but rejection. Her throat tightened. She deserves to know the truth. Deborah shook her head wildly, her face streaked with tears. How can we tell her? How can I face her after what I did? William's voice was firm, though heavy with regret. Because we have no choice. Secrets rot in the dark, Deborah. If we hide this, it will destroy us all. The room fell silent again, broken only by the sound of Deborah's quiet sobbing. Natalie sat frozen, staring at her hands. The fragile piece of her world was gone. Every certainty she had built was gone. But one thing remained, the knowledge that Vanessa was the missing twin. The sister Christopher never knew. The revelation stood like a mountain before them, impossible to ignore. And in that moment, Natalie understood that the story of her life of Christopher's and of Vanessa's had been bound together long before they ever met. Now the truth had surfaced, and nothing would ever be the same again. The decision was made almost instantly. Once the truth settled in, there was no hesitation left in William's voice. "We're going to find her," he said firmly. Deborah, though still shaking, nodded in agreement. Natalie felt the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. For years, Vanessa had been her closest friend, a sister in all but blood. And now, she was more than that. She was Christopher's true sister. Christopher had come home from a business trip that very evening, and Natalie knew she could not keep the secret from him any longer. Sitting at the Parker dining table, with Deborah's hands trembling around her teacup, they told him everything. That he was adopted, that his parents were not his biological parents, but had chosen him decades ago from the maternity ward. That he had a sister he never knew existed. Christopher's face drained of color, his hands balled into fists, then fell open again as though he no longer trusted them to hold onto anything solid. "All my life," he murmured, voice breaking. "You lied to me all my life." His eyes filled with tears as he turned toward Natalie. "And Vanessa, your Vanessa, she's mine?" Natalie reached for his hand. "Yes, she's your sister." For a long moment, silence stretched. Then Christopher pushed back his chair. "We can't waste another day. We go to her. Tonight." The drive through the Arizona desert was heavy with unspoken thoughts. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating scrub brush and long stretches of empty road. Natalie sat beside Christopher, her hand resting on his knee, though neither spoke much. In the back seat, Deborah stared out the window, lips moving silently in what could only be prayer, while William kept his hands steady on the wheel, jaw clenched with grim determination. Each mile carried a storm of emotions. Fear, of rejection, of what Vanessa might say. Shame, for the choices made long ago, for the years lost. Hope, that somehow, despite everything, a family could be mended. Natalie felt all of it pressing in, the air inside the car almost suffocating. They drove through the night, the desert stretching endlessly, stars burning bright above. At one point, Christopher whispered, "What if she hates me? What if she doesn't want to know me?" Natalie turned, her voice soft but firm. "Then at least she'll know the truth, and you'll know you tried." By dawn, they pulled into the tired neighborhood where Vanessa lived. The streets were cracked, houses lined close together with peeling paint and sagging porches. Children's bikes lay rusting on sidewalks, and the faint smell of oil drifted from an auto shop down the block. It was a far cry from the neat rows of Deborah's garden or the tidy ranch house they had left behind. Natalie led them up the narrow staircase to Vanessa's apartment. She hesitated before knocking, her heart racing. When the door opened, Vanessa stood there, her hair pulled back hastily, dark circles beneath her eyes. Harper clung to her leg, her tiny hand clutching a worn teddy bear. Natalie. Vanessa's voice was tired but surprised. What are you doing here so early? Natalie's throat tightened. She glanced back at Christopher, who looked as though the ground beneath him was crumbling. Deborah stepped forward, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Vanessa, Natalie said gently, there's something we need to tell you. Something you deserve to know. At first, Vanessa's guard went up. She crossed her arms, suspicion flashing in her eyes. But as Natalie spoke, laying out the story, Deborah's time as a nurse, the twins born decades ago, the mother who abandoned them, the pendant that never left Vanessa's neck, the suspicion gave way to shock. Vanessa's hand flew to her chest, fingers brushing the familiar shape of the rose pendant. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That can't be. Christopher's voice broke as he stepped forward. It's true. You're my sister, and I'm adopted. The words hung in the air like thunder. Harper tugged at Vanessa's hand, confused by the adult's tears, while Vanessa herself swayed as though the floor had shifted beneath her. She looked from Christopher to Deborah, to William, and finally to Natalie, her friend who had carried the secret unknowingly all these years. You mean, Vanessa's voice trembled, all this time I wasn't just abandoned? I had a family? A brother? Deborah reached out, her sobs uncontrollable. Yes, and I failed you. I failed you so terribly. Please forgive me. For a moment, anger flashed in Vanessa's eyes, the years of struggle and rejection rising to the surface. But then her gaze fell on Christopher, standing there broken, desperate, and she saw not a stranger, not an enemy, but the brother she had never known she needed. Slowly, tears spilled down her cheeks. She bent and scooped Harper into her arms, clutching her close. I don't know how to forgive you, she whispered to Deborah, but maybe I can try. For her, for Harper, for me. Christopher stepped forward, his hands trembling as he wrapped them around Vanessa in a tentative embrace. She stiffened, then collapsed into his arms, sobbing against his shoulder. In that moment, decades of silence cracked open, and something fragile yet powerful began to form, a bond neither of them had ever imagined, but both had longed for in ways they could not name. For Natalie, watching the scene unfold, it was as though the world had tilted into a new shape. The truth had broken everything, and yet it had also given them something precious. In the dim morning light of that shabby apartment, the Parker family stood reborn, reshaped not by lies, but by the raw power of truth. Vanessa didn't move, and right away. At first, she resisted, her pride bruised, her trust still fragile. But Natalie and Christopher wouldn't let her slip back into the shadows. Deborah visited nearly every day, cooking meals for her and Harper, quietly restocking her fridge. William drove her to medical appointments, insisting she see a cardiologist who could finally give her the care she had long been denied. Slowly, with every act of kindness, Vanessa's defenses began to soften. By early autumn, she agreed to come stay with the Parkers. Deborah prepared the guest room, filling it with fresh linens and a small bed for Harper. William hauled furniture from the garage, while Christopher painted the walls a soft yellow. When Vanessa stepped inside for the first time, Harper squealed with delight at the sight of toys laid out neatly in a corner. Vanessa stood frozen, tears in her eyes, realizing she and her daughter finally had more than survival, they had a home. Life adjusted around the new rhythm. Natalie helped Vanessa apply for a position as a teacher's aide at her school, easing her into work that was gentler on her body. Vanessa, shy at first, soon found herself smiling as she read with the children, her natural warmth shining through. Harper thrived too, racing through the Parker backyard, her laughter ringing against the desert sky. For the first time in years, Vanessa allowed herself to exhale. Doctors confirmed her condition was serious but manageable with treatment and careful monitoring. The Parkers spared no effort, driving her to appointments, covering the costs her insurance couldn't, reminding her she was no longer alone in the fight. Each day, she felt the bitterness of her past loosen its grip. The anger that had once burned inside her was slowly replaced by something unfamiliar: belonging. Christopher struggled at first, reeling from the shock of learning his entire identity had been built on secrets. But as the weeks passed, he and Vanessa grew closer. They spent hours talking on the porch, sharing memories of foster homes, comparing scars from childhood, and filling in the years they had lost. To Christopher, it was as though a missing part of himself had finally been restored. To Vanessa, it was proof she had never been entirely abandoned. Her brother had always been out there, waiting, even if neither of them knew it. As Christmas approached, Deborah and William threw themselves into preparations. The Parker home glowed with string lights, a towering tree filling the living room with the scent of pine. Stockings were hung, one for each family member, including Vanessa and Harper. When Vanessa saw her name stitched carefully in red thread, she pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. Harper squealed at the sight of her stocking, clutching it like a treasure. On Christmas Eve, the entire family gathered around the table. Deborah served roast turkey with all the trimmings. William carved slices with steady hands, and Natalie carried dishes back and forth, her cheeks flushed from the kitchen's heat. Harper sat between Vanessa and Christopher, giggling as he made faces across the table. For a while, it was easy to forget the years of pain and distance. The house was alive with warmth, laughter, and the smell of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven. As the meal drew to a close, William raised his glass. His voice trembled as he looked around the table. "We've made mistakes. Mistakes I wish we could undo. But tonight, looking at all of you, I know we've been given a second chance. And I don't intend to waste it." His eyes lingered on Vanessa, then Harper. Family isn't about what we've lost. It's about what we choose to hold on to. Tears shimmered in Vanessa's eyes. She reached across the table, squeezing William's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Later that evening, as gifts were exchanged and Harper tore through wrapping paper with delight, Natalie pulled Christopher aside, her hands resting lightly on her stomach. His eyes widened, and she nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "We're having a baby," she whispered. Christopher's arms wrapped around her instantly, laughter breaking through the tension that had lingered in his heart for weeks. He kissed her forehead, overwhelmed with joy. When they announced it to the family, Deborah cried openly, William clapped Christopher on the back, and Vanessa hugged Natalie tightly, whispering, "This baby will never know what it means to be alone." As the night wore on, Vanessa sat on the couch, Harper curled against her, watching Christopher and Natalie by the fire. For the first time, she felt no bitterness, no sharp sting of envy. Instead, she felt peace. She had a brother. She had a family. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, they no longer defined her. Christopher caught her gaze across the room, and in that quiet moment, both siblings smiled. They had been separated at birth, their lives diverging in ways neither could have imagined. Yet here they were, reunited not by chance but by the persistence of truth. It was as though a missing half of themselves had finally come home. Natalie looked around the room. The twinkling lights, the warmth of Deborah's embrace, William's steady presence, Vanessa's quiet smile, Harper's laughter, and felt her chest swell with gratitude. She had once dreamed of a family while blowing out candles in a foster home. Now she had one. Not perfect, not free of mistakes, but real and whole. The night ended with everyone gathered around the tree, Harper fast asleep in Vanessa's arms, the fire crackling low. Deborah whispered a prayer of thanks. William hummed a carol under his breath, and Natalie rested her hand over her growing belly. In that moment, the truth was undeniable. Family was never just about blood. It was about love, forgiveness, and the courage to face the past in order to build a better future.